Wanted Dead goes out of its way to speak to a very certain type of player. Yes, it's true that includes those of us that fondly remember the more straight-up action games of the PS2 or early PS3 years. But more precisely, it's directly aimed at those who enjoyed games that weren't afraid to throw them to the wolves and required near mastery of their combat to get through its many dangerous encounters. It makes perfect sense then that many of the folks primarily leading the charge developing Wanted Dead were also key talent behind some of the most challenging action games of that time, the Ninja Gaiden games. So while the flavor of Wanted Dead's gameplay is certainly a classic one, it's more accurately described as reminiscent of Ryu Hayabusa's adventures than anything else. And that's an important distinction to make here, because it could be a turnoff if you jump into this expecting something more in line with Devil May Cry, or 2009's Wet, as some folks have likened it to. The shock of Wanted Dead's true identity was certainly a bucket of cold water for me. Wanted Dead makes good on its promise of being rather straight-laced. The simple skill tree, dodging and rolling, cover-based shooting, and hack-and-slash combos are instantly familiar and work well with the deadly ballet of its combat, with reasonably generous stim-pack pickups and a one-time teammate revival per life. The game does seem like it's extending a little bit of an olive branch, but it's by no means enough to sidestep intimate knowledge of its ins and outs. Mixing the pistol and sword slashes to stun enemies and take them down with John Wick-style executions is a really nice touch, and definitely adds some style points to the combat. And with a skill tree that almost always has something new available, the progression feels pretty good, despite many of the abilities feeling like they should be in your base moveset, like rolling and even grenades. Just having grenades is a skill that needs to be unlocked. Still, the combat itself is a totally decent foundation, although it does trip itself up a little bit too often for my taste. Occasionally janky animations, a somewhat finicky cover system that pops our heroine right out of cover if you look behind you, and a camera that doesn't do you many favors with a default angle that obscures your enemies in close quarters when you need to see what they're doing the most. I missed more than my fair share of red glowing unblockable attack indicators because of this, and that can be pretty annoying when trying to engage with a combat system that has no lock-on function and requires as much precision as this one does. Also, there are some odd rules, like getting stabbed being infinitely more harmful than being shot, which took me a bit of mental rewiring to get used to. Wanted Dead also mixes in some over-the-shoulder shooting, and while it definitely works, it stops short of being particularly fun or useful a lot of the time, with upgrades that often take as much from your stats as they give, making them feel kinda pointless, and the most basic enemies absorbing entire clips, like your flats trying to kick SpongeBob's butt. If you have some distance and want to thin a herd of enemies out a little bit before you go running in cutting off limbs, the shooting can feel useful, and getting a hold of better, more specialized guns later on also helps somewhat, but overall it feels very much secondary to the sword-pistol combat, which is thankfully much more fun to do. Once you wrap your head around its quirks, the combat in Wanted Dead can shine. When it's all working, I totally get it, even though I'm generally not big on this particular flavor of challenging action, and the jankiness was bordering on unacceptable at times. I could see the game really come together the more I played it. Once I got about a third of the abilities unlocked and really got into it, I'd be lying if I said my opinion didn't improve significantly. Had the shooting felt a little bit better, or the camera been a little more useful, or the enemy variety been a little more than the same one or two enemy types per level, I really think it would have clicked with me more, because all these things aren't that big of a deal on their own. It's just the culmination of them that kept the combat from being truly special, although there is a spider tank, so bonus points for that. Story-wise, Wanted Dead doesn't fare too well. Hannah Stone and her cohorts are about as interesting as mashed potatoes, which, to be fair, isn't a big deal in a game like this, and honestly kind of sells the PS2 era vibe even more in a way, just not in a good one. The story does occasionally threaten to go somewhere interesting, especially with some genuinely funny interactions at HQ and minigames in between levels, but the bland writing and dull performances never really let it grow into anything more.
Nice.
On visuals alone, the game surprised me with how it combined the detailed and dynamic environments and the absolutely awesome anime cutscenes. But that also kind of just highlights what a shame it is that the voice acting and story itself are so unremarkable, because just a little more effort in those areas would have really gone well with the visual style. Thankfully, the music is pretty legit, particularly the new metal tracks that go perfectly with slicing up fodder enemies and taking on the more challenging ones. The 80s synth songs in the background of calmer moments also worked really well. Sound effects also complement the action well. Gunshots crack through the air nicely, and I felt a strange level of satisfaction with the operatic screams bellowing out of enemies as I reduced their bodies to meaty chunks. If you're somebody that enjoys a little bit of bite to their action games, you'll probably find at least a few things to love about Wanted Dead. How much further it goes with you will largely depend on two things: your personal enjoyment of this sort of difficulty, and your tolerance level for fiddly cameras and comatose voice acting. Regardless of whether this sort of game is something that resonates with you personally, you gotta respect it, and I certainly do. But at the end of the day, Wanted Dead stands in direct contrast to other modern but classic-style action games like Evil West or Solstice that I would normally be drawn to a little easier. Those games evoke our nostalgia for classic PS2-style action by focusing only on the fun parts of it, while Wanted Dead leans into the more challenging side of the coin, along with some of the jankiness and repetition of that era that rose-tinted nostalgia goggles make easy to ignore. Still yet, it is indeed an authentic homage to the classic Ninja Gaiden games that came before it, and even has a few neat ideas of its own to boot. I can't say it ultimately adds up to much more than that, but I'd still say it's a ride worth taking if you know what you're getting into.